This is Dr. Heather Austin Robillard, and today's lecture we will be discussing culture, ethnicity, and race as it relates to addiction. It's important for us to understand in this topic how these factors can contribute to the development, the maintaining, and the recovery of those who struggle with an addiction. I'd like you to first take a moment to close your eyes and think about what you see when you think about an addict. What traits did you assign to an addict prior to this class? How did these stereotypes shape your attitude towards addicts? What has changed thus far in this class? And how does this change your attitude towards addicts? When thinking about addiction and multiculturalism, we want to understand a few important concepts. One, it's important to understand our own perception or bias towards addicts, towards culture and race. It's important to understand and see strengths and values behind different cultural beliefs and behaviors, even our own. Cultural competence does not have to mean acceptance or agreement. And the role of the paradigm individualism versus collectivism. We'll learn more about how some cultures are more collectivism, whereas some cultures are more individualism, and how that pertains or impacts how we understand addiction and the treatment of addiction. You can actually ask most any questions of a different culture or ethnicity with just genuine curiosity. It's very important to understand what cultural competency means. The definition of cultural competency is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals. It enables them to work effectively in a cross-cultural situation. It does not mean knowing all there is to know regarding one specific culture. Most people don't know everything about their own culture. What it does mean is that you have the understanding, skills, and resources to work well and be helpful to other races and cultures that are different from your own. There are two different ways that you can approach somebody of a different culture. One is an expert position, and one is a non-knowing position. Posing as an expert can be detrimental to working with addicts of a different culture than your own. By using a not knowing position, then you leave the individual space to express themselves and avoid stereotyping and teaching someone what their own culture is about. Some people get educated regarding a culture and then they assume they are an expert in that culture. This can cause problems for many reasons, but some of the major problems include not being able to establish a relationship with the people you are working with. You can come off as condescending instead of being helpful, and you may group individuals together instead of seeing their unique differences. I want to also look at the differences between culture, ethnicity, and race. Culture are certain behaviors, attitudes, rituals that are accepted and familiar within a certain group of people. This affects how addiction is viewed in society. It also affects how we understand getting treatment or recovery. And it can even affect how we define addiction in each individual culture. Race can also be important to understand, but be careful not to label. This is how we can stereotype forms. Much of the addiction literature is categorized by race. However, it can be better to focus on ethnicity and culture rather than race, because this better reflects the richness of the experience of these groups of individuals. Some other important points are that 99.9% of our DNA sequences are common to everyone. There are important differences between each culture, ethnicity, and race, but we are more the same than we are different. Here's some dimensions of cultural differences. I mentioned already there's a difference between individualism and collectivism for different cultures, ethnicities, and races. There's also a difference in their power distance. Some have less power differentiation between different family units, genders, all of that, than other cultures. There are going to be different gender expectations for different ethnicities, races, and cultures. There's also different time orientation. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that Germans tend to think that being late is 10 minutes before you're supposed to be there. Whereas there's other cultures where being late is not that big of a deal. The last one is high context versus low context. So what this means is that certain cultures rely on high context. High context is when cultures rely on communicating with implicit and relying a lot on the context, whereas low context cultures rely on explicit and verbal communication. Those in high context cultures rely on interpersonal relationships, whereas low context are going to be more of those westernized cultures like the United States and Australia, where nonverbal communication is not significant. The rest of this lecture, we're going to go over a lot of different statistics between ethnicity, culture, and race. The important thing to understand is just by talking about these statistics, it may create certain stereotypes in our minds. But as we've been learning about how to evaluate different data, numbers, and statistics, we want to think of some possible alternative explanations rather than just their race or ethnicity that provides these statistics. So in this diagram, we see the percent of past month use of alcohol and drugs and their abuse and dependence levels against different single race and ethnicities. You'll see the red circles represent the most frequent use of drugs within each ethnicity, whereas the blue represents the ethnicity with the highest frequency across the different ethnicities. So if we look in the white category, alcohol use is both the most frequent in their ethnicity and is the highest frequency across all ethnicities. Whereas black, they have the highest use is alcohol use among their ethnicity, but they don't have anything that is the highest among all ethnicities. We see that American Indian and Alaskan Natives have tobacco use is the highest in their ethnicity and highest among all other ethnicities. They also have the highest among all other ethnicities with illicit drug use, substance abuse or dependence, illicit drug abuse or dependence, and alcohol abuse and dependence. Asian Americans, or the Asian category, has the highest among their ethnicity with alcohol use. Hispanic has their highest in the alcohol use and the highest binge drinking across all ethnicities. So what's important to identify here is that there may be alternative explanations for each of these. You noticed how in the white category, they had the highest alcohol use among all ethnicities and races. However, the American Indians and Alaskan Natives had the highest alcohol abuse and dependence. So it's possible that the way we define alcohol abuse and dependence is more stigmatized towards American Indians and Alaskan Natives than it is towards the white and Caucasians. So that's something to be thinking about, is what are the alternative explanations? When looking at this data, some alternative explanations to be thoughtful about is minority stress. This is a cultural ascription of inferior status to a specific group. So when minorities are seen as an inferior ethnicity or race, then this can cause automatic stress to that person. This inferior status may be applied to certain demographic categories. It can be applied to age, sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation. So anything that gives you a minority status can automatically create an extra stress barrier for that individual. The ascription of defectiveness may precipitate those negative life events, and when repeated over time can cause a sense of powerlessness within the individual, potentially leading them to have maladaptive behaviors and responses, such as coping through drugs, alcohols, or addictive behaviors. So thinking about maybe it's not their race and ethnicity, but the added minority stress of being in a low socioeconomic class and status that precipitates those negative life events where using drugs and alcohol may be their only way of coping with that added stress. This is where a one-down approach would recognize that each person is different, and even with the statistics that are available, this does not mean that we can assume that all individuals fit into the statistics provided. When it comes to the Native American culture, there are a lot of different stereotypes that can come to mind. One or more of the popular ones is what we call the firewater myth, or the belief that Native Americans are more susceptible to alcohol than other races. Research has actually shown this to be false. Why are the alcohol-related deaths higher in this population than in the general population? The answer is actually still unclear. Some research has proposed that since the effects of alcohol are less in this culture, then they may need to drink more in order to become dependent to the alcohol. This is something that we have found in Caucasian men. There are also some genetic components to addiction that are still not understood very well. Culture and poverty probably play a role in this statistic as well. Native Americans had their lands, possessions, and sometimes their children taken away from them, and now they are given some unwanted land and very little resources. Things like this appear to be getting better as some tribes are addressing this problem as more research and information continues to come in. There are many components of this problem not yet looked at, and more understanding is needed regarding this population. This slide presents some of the discrepancies and possible explanations surrounding why Black Americans suffer greater consequences for the same amount of drinking than do white participants. The issue is clearly more complicated than this slide can present, but the information gives us some important things to think about. So what is the difference in this population that allows the consequences of alcohol use to be much worse despite drinking the same amount, maybe even slightly less? Many people think that the biggest problem comes from the discrimination and stereotypes. A white man could commit the same crime as an African American man and receive much less of a severe punishment. In fact, research has shown there's this exact pattern in our country. Does racism still exist? There is ample evidence pointing out that racism is still a big problem in America. Many forms of racism have changed from a more overt, violent, and obvious type to a more subtle kind of racism. For example, it would be very shocking to find a store that would not allow African Americans to shop there, but African Americans are followed around in stores every day for the fear that they're going to shoplift. Again, in this slide, we see some difficult barriers that make addiction and recovery more difficult and are some things that put this population at risk. This is also another population that gets grouped together when there are significant differences within the Latino population. As you look at this slide and see all the challenges that this population could possibly face, what do you think is the biggest or most difficult to overcome? Machismo versus Marianismo, these roles play a big part in a Latino's family life. The men, or machismo, are in charge. They are macho and bold. They go out and make the money. The women, Marianismo, are submissive and generally stay at home taking care of things. They are generally the cooks and the cleaners, as well as the primary caregivers for their kids. It is important to note that although there is a common aspect of the Latino culture, we cannot assume that all Latinos fall into these two categories. This approach would be taking the expert perspective and not the one-down perspective. An example of the one-down perspective is when I'm working with clients of a different culture of mine. It is important for them to tell me more about their culture so that I can gather information about it, rather than me telling them what I know about their culture. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have a huge risk of getting stereotyped. There are so many different ethnicities and cultures getting grouped into this one statistical group that it becomes very difficult to understand the specific challenges that this population face. There's a big difference in what Asians make, some of them being well below poverty and others making large amounts of money. This is why their median income is so high, but there still exists a lot of poverty in this population. This same disparity is found in education level. This plays a role in substance and abuse recovery. So this can be an alternative explanation for why Asian Americans might have a specific statistic, is that there's such a huge difference between those in a high class Asian American versus those in a low poverty class, or those with high education levels and those versus low. So maybe it's not their race that causes them to use drugs and alcohol, but maybe it's their class and their education level. I would challenge you to think of some of these stereotypes that are associated with this population and discover what your beliefs are. Maybe you are stereotyping them, or you have in the past. How can you use this type of self-examination to help us better become professionals who work with different cultures and addiction? Filial piety is another value held by many Asian Americans. This value is about the importance of respecting your parents, grandparents, and ancestors. This value plays a big part in how Asians live their lives. It is possible that someone could be biologically addicted to a substance, but if it's not interfering with their treatment of their family, then it is not considered a problem. Once the issue trickles into the family, then it might need to be addressed. Since family is so important, the actions of family members reflect on the family as a whole. There is a lot of shame that goes in with seeking outside treatment. This can be perceived as a failure, and the person who goes for outside help runs the risk of being rejected by their family. This can present a particularly significant challenge when someone is addicted and needs help, but feels like this is out of the question to seek it from a professional. A common mistake that people make is thinking that addiction affects everyone the same way. Sure, there is a biological impact of addiction that does the same thing to any brain, regardless of race, culture, and ethnicity. But just like every disease, there's always a psychological, social, spiritual component that comes along with this biological effect on the disease of addiction. Some important barriers to be aware of are the double stigmas that we have discussed in this class. It is not uncommon for an addict to be discriminated against, and when you pair this up with being Black, Asian, or another minority status, you get a double stigma. One stigma is tough enough, so adding others on top of this can be extremely challenging. And what about all the wrong that the health profession has done to these minorities in the past? It is not very likely that you will go to the doctor when you have grown up learning that they cannot be trusted. One example of this is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where doctors offered to give Black men free health care as part of an experiment testing bad blood. What the men were not told was that they had syphilis, and though there was a well-known cure, the doctors withheld this cure from them in order to continue the study. This went on in the 1970s. This was an experiment funded and organized by the U.S. Public Health Service, so it's not hard to see why some might have a hard time trusting the healthcare system. If you remember back to when we talked about randomized control study, this is where ethics comes into place. We're no longer able to withhold a treatment service or a cure if there's not another one provided when we do a research study. Language is another thing that needs to be considered. Even if someone speaks English very well, there may still be some words that they do not understand or do not translate well in their language. Ethnicity, culture, and race becomes a huge part when we think about the treatment and recovery of addiction. Ethnic loss is what we have been discussing throughout this lecture. It means grouping individuals into a group such as race and treating the individuals like the group stereotype. This can cause harm because it can keep you from some critical information about the individual that would otherwise be helpful to their treatment. It is hard to learn about people when we use ethnic gloss. Look at the list of important factors that you should be aware of. There are a lot of things that need to be discussed and addressed. This list is not comprehensive, but is a good demonstration of some extra challenges you might face when working with ethnic minorities. Why would it be important to break down these stereotypes when trying to understand addiction? Addiction is so complex. It is similar and different for each individual, and the stereotypes can keep us from the real important issues that might be detrimental to their their treatment. There are some benefits to knowing the stereotypes, though. One example is if you understand the stereotypes, then you can have a better understanding of what the individual is going through, which can lead to better treatment. I hope that this lecture has made it clear that stigmas can have a negative impact on people who are needing help. There is a lot of work to do in this world and in this country of getting rid of the stigmas of race, ethnicity, and addiction. Helping people who have been stigmatized in a non-judgmental and caring way can go a long way to the road for recovery.